An Affliction of the Heart by Anonymous Pegasus. Chapter 3 Plans. Kuno stared glumly into the mirror, batting at her bell, watching the way it rocked back and forth, its negligible weight barely permeable. She still could not hear it. A collection of books lay scattered about her, left where she had thrown them when she was done reading them. Some of them she had even read twice, but already she was bored with that. She had always been a fast reader, and the collection of stories had barely given her a few hours of amusement. It was amazing how slowly time could pass when one had nothing to do. Kuno had already tried to change her form once, and it had failed. The pain in her injured ears told her that they were nowhere near being fully healed yet, and that was a good sign, she felt. If her ears were still healing, then her hearing may yet return. The world was oddly bleak without noise. It was strange. She could still feel her heartbeat and her breathing, but they made no sound. The touch of a hoof at her shoulder made her jump, and she grit her teeth in surprise and dismay. She really needed to stop being snuck on like that. Turning, she found Warden standing behind her. For the first time since she had arrived, he wasn't wearing his guard armor. Underneath the armor, he was actually rather handsome, in a rather unkempt way. His mane and tail were messy, and he had a rough look that was appealing without being too intimidating. He was all over white, and his blue mane was just the right hue to make him look stunning. Kuno noticed very quickly that his cutie mark was a trestle with vines growing over it. Not the cutie mark one would expect from a royal guard. The changeling's mind began to work, pondering on this new piece of information. Why would a royal guard have a cutie mark pertaining to gardening of all things? Slowly the pieces clicked together in Kuno's mind. Warren's unwillingness to harm her, or to see her harmed through his own actions, not a trait that the royal guard was exactly famous for. His garden, neat, tended, and perfect, his stew apparently home-cooked, the fact that he lived at the base of the mountains and not in the barracks, then all the pieces neatly fit into Kuno's mind. Warden was part of the reserve guard. The reserve guard was a contingent of the royal guard militia, normal ponies trained in the arts of war to be called to services in times of emergency and martial law. Having changelings running free in the populace definitely counted as an emergency. So, Warden was part of the reserve guard and had been called to duty. But the Pegasus lacked the conviction to follow through with his orders, resulting in Kuno's current predicament. He couldn't let her roam free, but if he gave her to the royal guards, she would be executed. Kuno was barely aware of what Warden's saying something to her, and she snapped back to reality with a blink. A piece of paper was thrust in front of her nose. Dinner time. Making sure that Warden could see, she nodded and then offered him her throat. Without a pause, the Pegasus clipped her tether onto the collar and then locked it in place. A tug at the collar urged her to follow him, and she fell in behind the Pegasus, ears splayed back, and frown on her muzzle. She didn't much like being led around like a mule or some kind of pack animal. It was demeaning. In the back of her mind, Kuno pondered her next move. Warden wasn't a true royal guard. He was a weekend warrior, a part-time badass. Therefore, he would be much more prone to mistakes, even though he hadn't made any glaring mistakes at her captivity so far. Once more, Kuno's tether was clipped to the iron ring and then locked into place by a second padlock. Examining the tether itself, she found that it was tightly wound nylon and would take hours of work to fray rope like that, not to mention a sharp surface. The smell of food broke her train of thought, and the changeling turned towards the table, her stomach rumbling. A half a load of bread and a bowl of stew was placed in front of her, and she fell into it with a ravenous hunger. Hot mouthfuls of bread and stew filled Kuno's mouth and belly, but it didn't even sate her appetite. It was like drinking a cup of water while hunger gnawed at your stomach. It was something, but it made the hunger hurt. Are you okay? Kuno barely registered the words on the notepad in front of her face. She groggily shook her head to try and clear off the sudden gray fog. She didn't even recall falling to the floor or passing out, or any of that. Warden was staring down at her, biting his bottom lip. The changeling blinked heavily, and then tried to push her hooves, wincing. Her body was refusing to listen to her, and she had barely the strength to rise. A powerful hoof under her form helped her up, and she staggered in place as her frame failed her. "I'm fine," Kuno muttered, trying to push him away with a hoof. Her aim misjudged, sending her crashing to the floor again. This time she felt it. One of her already injured wings folded under her, and she gave a weak cry of pain, trying to squirm it free and straight again. Powerful hooves wrapped around her midsection and squirmed against them futilely. before just allowing them to do what they would allow her. Her head was swimming with hunger pangs that no normal food could stay, and each a stab that needed was like a knife in her side, being twisted and jerked side to side. Even breathing was beginning to hurt. Kuno couldn't help but wonder if this was what it felt like to die. The changeling barely registered the fact that she was being carried somewhere. The tether at her neck was unclipped, although the collar remained, with the heavy weight of the padlock swinging from it. She was carried into a room she didn't recognize, and yet then set down on a soft, warm bed with felt covers. Feebly shifting, Kuno tried to lift her head, only to have a hoof press her firmly back down. The hoof touched at her neck and on her hooves, as though searching for a pulse.
Base of the ears,
Kuno said thickly, automatically. Already a hazy grayness was seeping into her vision. A hoof moved to the base of her ears, where the chitin was soft and flexible, allowing her heartbeat to be permeable.
I'm fine,
Kuno murmured, trying to push herself to her hooves weakly. She would not allow for this pony to see her weak. She was strong, and if she was going to die of hunger, she was going to do it in a dignified fashion. But somewhere in the back of her mind, Kuno knew that this was only the start. The hunger would get worse from here on out. She had at least a week of agony left to live.
You are not fine,
a gruff voice said, as though from a great distance. The hoof held her down all the more firmly, paced over her shoulders so she couldn't move. The jingle of the bell, the muffled sounds of the chitin fur against her and felt bedspread, sounds flooded into the changeling's mind. She could hear again. Everything was muted, as though there was a pane of thick glass between her and the noises, but she could hear. Kuno relaxed, then, going limp and just laying there, splayed out on her side, wings in disarray as the Pegasus checked over her.
Goddess, why'd you have to show up in that bloody field?
The Pegasus growled, pulling back to stare at her, lips pursed and eyes narrowed. Kuno didn't look at Warden, didn't give him any indication that she heard his words. Instead, she focused on the rest of the room, peering at her surroundings without appearing to do so. It was a clean room, neat and tidy, with a few furnishings here and there. There was a bookcase on the wall, a cupboard with an old spring-wound alarm clock, a potted flower plant of the yellow variety, and a single photograph framed in silver. It showed a younger Warden and a yellow earth pony female. The two of them were smiling and looked happy. Warren caught her looking and snapped the photo face down with a scowl, growling at the base of his throat.
Just stay here,
the pony said, waving his front of his hoof there to get her attention. When Kuno looked up at him, he mouthed the words, "Stay here," and pantomimed her remaining in place. Despite the gnawing pain in her stomach, Kuno had to resist the urge to giggle. The Pegasus moved back to the kitchen, leaving her alone. The muffled sounds of him moving were barely audible to her hearing ears, but she knew she didn't have long. Casting her gaze around and racking her mind for what to do, Kuno decided to use her dwindling strength to push herself up to her hoofs. A quick step and a short hop allowed her to grip the dresser and pull it down with all her weight. The cupboard landed across her back as she fell under it, and she cried out in pain, whimpering, trying to get to crawl free. The alarm clock hit the floor and shattered loudly, sending cogs and springs scattering all over the place. The pot-like plant likewise shattered, showering the floor with clods of dirt and broken pottery. One of the drawers half open and an assortment of seeds and packets spilled out, adding to the mess. Several long, long moments later, the cupboard was hefted off her, and powerful hooves once more lifted her from the floor.
I'm fine,
Kuno protested weakly, struggling and pushing as the Pegasus' chest feebly as best as she could. Once again, the changeling was deposited on the ground, and Warden scowled at her. Warden left again, and Kuno didn't move this time. By the time he came back from the kitchen with a fresh bowl of stew, trying his best to spoon-feed her, Kuno had already hidden the spring she had purloined. She held it tightly at the base of her wing, where the weight of her wing itself would keep it lodged in place, safe and sound until she needed it.